Hello everyone and welcome to this video tutorial on how to apply the law on theft to a criminal law scenario. In this tutorial we're going to be looking at the Ronnie and the umbrella mini scenario. We're going to recap the law on theft and then we're going to look at how we use that idea structure to get a really nice answer to a scenario on theft. As always, let's start by looking at the scenario that we've been given. So it says it's raining heavily, so Ronnie decides to borrow Luke's umbrella, which he's borrowed several times before. The umbrella gets damaged in the wind, so Ronnie throws it away and decides not to mention it to Luke. And you're being asked to advise Ronnie on his criminal liability. Straight away, we can see that this is a question that doesn't tell you what crime you need to apply. We obviously know that this is a theft mini scenario, but if you got that phrasing in the exam, you'd have to know just from reading that it's theft that it wanted. In the exam, you might get lucky and it might say advise Ronnie on his criminal liability for theft. That's always nice because it gives you confidence that you're applying the right crime. But hopefully when you've read this, although it doesn't look like a typical theft that people expect, because we've got a borrowing and a throwing it away, hopefully you're confident enough with the content on theft to recognise that that is theft because you're dealing with somebody else's property in a way that only the owner is entitled to. So I think this is a really good point for us to just recap the law on theft. On this slide then, we've got a theft summary. I would recommend, because this area is so big, there's so much to theft in so many cases, be a really good idea for you to go back to a previous video tutorial where I just went through all of the law on theft, all of the cases. We've only got time for a quick recap here. But if you remember, our definition of theft comes from Section 1 of the Theft Act. And it tells us that theft is the dishonest appropriation of property belonging to another with the intention to permanently deprive. And as lawyers, we have to break that down into our actus reus and our mens rea. So if we start with the actus reus then, firstly, there has to be an appropriation. And Section 3 defines what an appropriation is. So it's dealing with property in a way that only the owner is entitled to. So when Ronnie throws away Luke's umbrella, he's appropriating it because only the owner has the right to throw away their own property. So appropriation has a much wider meaning, than most people think it does. Most people think appropriation is just taking, but we've seen in a number of cases that selling property, switching labels, tugging on a bag, even if there's consent, even if it's a gift, that can all come within the meaning of an appropriation. Section 4 defines property, and we've got some cases on body parts and exam papers, which often comes up in scenarios, although not in our one today. And Section 4's got some special subsections, 4.3 and 4.4, telling us that wild mushrooms and flowers can't be stolen, nor can wild creatures. Section 5 tells us what belonging to another means, and this can be wider than the public expects, meaning that you are able to steal your own property because belonging to another includes possession and control as well as actual ownership. Woodman telling us that you can steal something from a person even if they don't know that they have it. And a bit like Section 4, we've got some special subsections here. Property received under an obligation, Davidge and Bene, and property received by mistake, AG's reference. These again often come up in scenarios in the exam, although not for us today in our scenario. So property under an obligation is where if someone gives you property and says, here's £5 for your lunch, and you actually spend it on the bus, then technically that can be a theft because you were given the money for a specific purpose. So it's still, according to the Theft Act 5.3, still technically belongs to the person who gave it to you until you use it for the purpose for which it was intended. Property received by mistake is where someone's perhaps given too much change in a shop or they're overpaid. If they recognise that that's happened, they are under a duty to give it back. Of mens rea, it's quite complicated here because we've got two mens rea elements. Firstly, our defendant must have been dishonest, and secondly, they must have the intention to permanently deprive. Strangely, if you remember, the Theft Act doesn't tell us what is dishonest, rather it actually lists 3 situations which are not dishonest, and that is reasonable belief in legal right, reasonable belief that the owner would have consented to you having it, and reasonable belief that the owner of the property can't be found by taking reasonable steps. So when you're looking at a scenario, you have to think, do any of these situations apply? Could your defendant possibly argue that he believed the other would want him to have it? And that might well be an argument that Ronnie can make. We'll come back to that one. If your situation doesn't fall within these 3 situations, we look to the common law, Ivy and Genting and Barton, and they tell us that behaviour is dishonest if the reasonable man would say it was dishonest. Okay, so it doesn't matter if the defendant's saying, I don't think I was dishonest, it's what the reasonable man would say. It's an objective test. And the other element is they must intend to permanently deprive. And that's where you've got the issue of borrowing coming in. Value-mill, very important case, which means that you basically can't borrow money from your safe at work and return different notes on the Monday. Lloyd telling us that borrowing can actually become a theft if the value, virtue and goodness is taken from the item. So if I borrow my sister's top and it gets covered in red wine and it's ruined and I give it back to her, although I'm going to argue, well, I just borrowed it, you've got it back now, I've stolen, if you like, all of the value from it because she can no longer use it. So a borrowing can become a theft. And Esom telling us that conditional intent is not enough for a theft. So that's a super quick recap of theft. But you can see just from that list that there's an awful lot to it, which makes answering a theft scenario quite challenging. In the real exam, you'll have quite a big scenario probably with lots of these issues in. Whereas today we're just looking at a mini scenario with just one thing happening really, which just touches on a couple of these points. Because there's so much to it, I think it's useful to have a little checklist when you're looking at scenarios, and that's what I've put together on this slide for you. So whenever you're looking at a scenario, you need to look at it in terms of the actus reus, which is green, and the mens rea, which is purple. So think to yourself, do I have an appropriation? And if so, where? Do I have property? Or is it something that's not capable of being stolen? Does it belong to another? Do any of those special situations apply? Was the person dishonest? Thinking about the 3 situations under section 2.1. I'm thinking about the reasonable man. Would they think it was dishonest? And do they have intention to permanently deprive? So with this in mind, let's go back to the Ronnie scenario and see if we can work out what the answer is. So coming back to Ronnie, and it's useful to highlight as we would in the exam. So I'm looking for all of those elements. So firstly, has there been an appropriation? So he's borrowed Luke's umbrella. So we've got an appropriation there. Sorry, I've not highlighted it all. And the fact it's an umbrella, that's your property. So we've got an appropriation, we've got property. Does it belong to another? Yes, well, it belongs to Luke. Was he dishonest? Now, this is where it says he's borrowed the umbrella several times before. Hopefully that jumped out at you, as being relevant, because what Ronnie's going to say is, well, I've used it several times before, I'm not being dishonest, because section 2.1b says, you know, reasonable belief in consent. I believe Luke would have consented to me using it, and also I plan to give it back. But then we see that the umbrella gets damaged in the wind, so Ronnie throws it away. So we've got another appropriation there, and the fact that he's decided not to mention it also indicates that at this point, although he didn't start perhaps with the intention to permanently deprive, when he decides not to mention it, he develops that intention at that point. So we know what the situation is. Let's now have a look at how we use IDEA to get a nice written answer to this. So on this slide, I've written how to apply the law on theft using IDEA, which we are used to. It's quite detailed, this slide, because there is so much to theft. And I wanted to make it as clear as possible what you need to do, because students often, particularly in the application, they just jump onto what's the main issue. So with Ronnie, he's thrown it away. So they just jump straight into that. But for theft, you need to go through every element in order. So I've tried to make that clear on this slide. So you might want to pause the video here so you can write down this plan for answering. So as always, we identify who our defendant is. So Ronnie might be liable for theft when he borrows the umbrella and throws it away. We then define the actus reus and the mens rea of theft. So the actus reus of theft is the appropriation of property belonging to another, and the mens rea of theft is dishonest intention to permanently deprive. So in our D, we just list it. Then E, we are going to explain what we've just listed there with our cases. And this is where your answer can get quite long. So you need to be quite succinct, putting your cases in brackets so that you don't run out of time. So explain what appropriation means under section 3 with your cases such as Pittam, Morris, etc. Explain property with your cases, belonging to another with your cases. Dishonesty, you're going to explain using the 3 subsections in section 2.1 and also your cases of Ivy and Barton. And then you're going to explain intention to permanently deprive, again with all the cases we looked at on our summary slide. So your E is basically you write out what was on the summary slide. And your A, you are going to apply all of that in the order that you've explained it. So this is almost like a checklist for what you're going to include in your application. So you're going to say whether there's an appropriation, whether you've got property, whether it belongs to another, were they dishonest using the situations in 2.1a to c, using the reasonable man test. You're going to say whether there was intention to permanently deprive, and then conclude, i.e. have you got all 5 elements for theft? So a lot to do here. On my next slide, I've done a bullet point mark scheme for the Ronnie scenario. So here's my scheme. I've done the actus reus in green, mens rea in orange, and I've put the cases in purple for you. I'm running out of time on my recording here, so I'm going to go straight into explaining the application, but we know what we're doing with our I, our D, and our E now anyway. So in terms of application, the actus reus is green. So Ronnie meets section 3.1 because by using and throwing away the umbrella, he's appropriated it. An umbrella is property under section 4. It belongs to another under section 5 because it belonged to Luke. In terms of the mens rea, Ronnie's going to say he's not dishonest under section 2.1b because of reasonable belief in consent, but presumably Luke wouldn't consent to him damaging and throwing the umbrella away, so that's unlikely to work. Ronnie may say he was planning to give it back, he was just borrowing it, but the goodness, value and virtue is gone, and that can still be a theft using Lloyd. And so once the umbrella's damaged and he throws it away, he meets that intention to permanently deprive, And at this point, the reasonable man would say he's dishonest in deciding not to mention it to Luke. So therefore, Ronnie's guilty of theft. So I hope that plan was useful to you. Try using it for some other scenarios.